Film and television is an art form of parts. However, not all of the parts are often treated with equal respect or attention from viewers. Acting, directing, and writing get the bulk of attention, yet cinema is nothing without every piece. A particularly underlooked element of the cinematic world is production design. Without production design, cameras simply capture reality and filmmakers are unable to shape the world into something special and unique, and utilize it to tell stories in the best way possible. The scope of set design is often used as a measure of its success, but just as with editing, more is not always better. Sometimes it is the sets that viewers do not notice that have the biggest effect. These sets allow audiences to settle into the world of the project without any distraction and blend together so well as to never break this immersion. In television, it is especially clear to see the effect of production design through the amount of time we get to experience the spaces. The time we get with shows also allow the set design to take a large role in the communicating of themes and ideas that reinforce the written story. This video essay will focus on the importance of production design in 4 specific shows and how it relates to their themes with regards to control over life and death. The 4 selected shows are 6 Feet Under, The Good Place, Westworld, and The Rehearsal. 6 Feet Under centers on the Fisher family as they go through ups and downs while managing a family-owned funeral home. The Good Place follows a quirky group of characters as they navigate the afterlife and the complexities that come with it. Westworld is about a futuristic theme park where extremely wealthy individuals interact with androids in a Western-themed area. For the sake of this video essay, only Season 1 will be discussed due to the more contained nature of that season. The Rehearsal is a reality show that follows Nathan Fielder as he attempts to create situations where people can rehearse real-world scenarios before having to actually do them. These 4 shows were chosen because of their themes of control in life and death, and how those themes are accentuated by the set design. In order to best discuss these shows, it is necessary to talk about details from throughout their runs, thus including spoilers for those who have not watched. It is necessary to include these details in order to paint the full picture of how impactful sets are within these worlds. The central hub. Each of these shows has a key central place that can be viewed as a central hub within the narrative. Each of these places is central to the themes of control and use set design to help reflect this, whether the topic is life or death. Sometimes this location is more clearly defined and plays a bigger role, but as mentioned earlier, sometimes it is the things that are reserved that have the biggest impact. Westworld is interesting as there can be 2 potential viewpoints when it comes to picking the central hub. The more elaborate and metaphorical choice is the train station where the guests of the park arrive. It lets them out into a classic Western town that creates a central point from which so many of the in-world stories take place, as well as the story threads that the viewer follows as well. It is the initial point of action for the guests, the point in the park in which the characters have the most control as the plotlines of the fabricated adventures are tightly controlled in this town. It is also discussed throughout the show that the further you venture from this point, the more wild the park becomes. This can be seen in both a narrative standpoint as well as a thematic one. The focus on this town is heavy early on, and the story is fairly straightforward, but as the story and characters travel further from this place, the more complex everything becomes. The set design of this town needs to feel incredibly real without feeling overly complicated, so as not to break the immersion for the viewers and the park guests. Yet, it is still grand and breathtaking because of the unknown that comes with what lies within and beyond. It serves as a gateway of sorts between what the characters view as the real and unreal, as well as the alive and the robotic. The other approach that could be taken when it comes to Westworld and the central hub idea is that of the control room. It is a far more literal approach, and in many ways an inverse to that of the town. This room is one of hypothetical complete control. It is stripped down and sleek from a design perspective, but lacking in soul. It reflects the characters that operate in the room as they soullessly control the park in a way far more mechanical than any of the androids in the park itself. The space can represent so much of the moral complexity of the show and tells the viewers a lot about the kind of people running the park. These 2 places work in conjunction as the central hubs of both the park world as well as the behind-the-scenes world. In a world centered on duality, you have 2 spaces that represent aspects of control. A completely different kind of town center is that of the Good Place. This central hub is incredibly prominent throughout the course of the show, but is more through the adaptation and changing of the space that control can be seen. Throughout the first season, it is a location that serves as a meeting point for many of the wacky afterlife activities of the main characters. But after it is revealed that the show actually takes place in a new attempt at the bad place, this space takes on a completely different character. It transforms from a colorful utopia into a manipulative and controlling prison for the protagonists. The audience sees this space go through numerous iterations over the course of the show, as the demons change the space in an attempt to maximize the suffering. However, this is never successful as Eleanor and the rest of the human characters consistently overcome the challenges thrown at them and find some level of happiness. Like Westworld, The Good Place is a space controlled by a group seemingly far more powerful than the inhabitants. The design of the sets never veers away from cheerful and colorful, but this is all a facade for sinister intentions. Westworld is a place that could have been widely used for good-intentioned fun, but is shown to be more of a release of violent and disturbing fantasies. Both of these shows reveal twisted aspects of their world in completely different ways, and set design is a major part of this. These shows are excellent examples of how the grandness of central spaces can have major implications on story themes and characters. However, the effectiveness of sets in The Rehearsal and 6 Feet Under is just as influential thematically, despite being more realistic and understated. The Rehearsal is very different from the rest, and since it has real people and places, it is less clear what the central space is in the show. The bar set from the first episode is a fascinating recreation of a real space, as many other sets in the show are. But no place is as prominently featured and as manipulated as the house that Fielder stays at for much of the show. This is another show in which a person manipulates elements of what the viewer sees from behind the scenes. Except with The Rehearsal, it's all real in a sense. Somehow, out of 3 shows that have an all-powerful demon, a high-tech control room of people, and a regular guy, it is this regular guy that has the most control over the outcomes of the manipulated situations. The house acts as a central space from which he operates and presents some of the strangest ways that he manipulates life. He has mirrors that age himself and others, fake seasons, and other methods in order to convey a quicker passage of time. Without control over the sets, he would have no control over the situations that he creates, defeating the purpose of them entirely. The house in 6 Feet Under acts in an entirely different way. Instead of it being a place controlled by a person, it is really the house that controls the people within. The house is at the forefront of nearly every episode of the show, and it is vital to how the characters interact with death throughout. The business, in conjunction with the house, controls so much of the daily lives of the Fisher family. It forces them into proximity with death constantly. Yet the house isn't this consistently bleak place devoid of color or beautiful detail. It is a complex space appropriately set in the center of a show filled with complex themes and emotions. We follow the Fishers as they progress throughout the story, and until the very end, the house remains mostly the same, as the house dictates their lives. It is only when the show finally feels at peace with its own end does this location change. This complexity is furthered with the layering of the different spaces within the home itself. Layers and zones. When considering production design, it is a wider-ranging factor than simply what is on screen at any one moment. It is a collection of different sets and locations that come together to create the overarching world of the show. Like all other elements of production, it is a collection of different pieces. Sometimes these pieces are never seen together, but through the production design's integration with the story, we still understand how the world flows and fits together, almost like the Kuleshov effect, but with sets. For example, in 6 Feet Under, we never see a side-by-side shot of the different levels of the Fisher home, yet despite this, we learn the structure of their house. We know that the bedroom and kitchen are on the upper floors, the funeral parlor is on the first floor, and the mortuary is in the basement, as well as the bomb shelter as an extra subterranean floor. Production design can also reveal where places are, such as that in Westworld. Through the map room and various elevator-like devices, a high-tech world exists below the park. These two separation of worlds exist in different styles, not only in terms of the designs of the sets, but also in serving massively different narrative functions from the other places. The set design is just another feature that helps delineate different themes and ideas on top of the already present portrayal through the script itself. The design of these sets, and the disconnect between them, can create more complex symbolic meaning. The entirety of 6 Feet Under is about death and this family's connection with it. Everything in this show connects back to this central theme, including the actual design of the house itself. The separation of the uses reflects the connection to death. The basement level is the closest to death, and also literally the closest the show gets to 6 Feet Under. It is the most directly the characters come into contact with death, and is a common location in the show for visions of the dead speaking with the living. The ground floor presents the middle ground between life and death, with the funeral parlor. The dead and living coexist in the space constantly. However, a very interesting design choice comes with the upper floors. The house is designed in such a way that the second floor serves the function of the typical ground floor. The house physically separates the typical living situation of the characters from the world of the dead. Despite this, the characters always have to pass through that ground floor when carrying out their daily lives. Unlike most people who can find ways to avoid interacting with death, the Fishers have no choice but to constantly be involved with it, even Claire, who isn't even part of the business. It is something that has a controlling influence over how they live their lives. The design of the house is meant to separate these two worlds, but even then it isn't enough to divide them. Even when characters move out from the house, death is still at the center of their lives. The connection of the living spaces to the workspace represents that connection in the lives of the characters as well. The division of vertical elements in a world can serve much different functions than that, though, such as that in Westworld. The mechanical behind-the-scenes portion of the park is seen as existing underground and below much of the park structure. This illustrates a very different kind of dynamic than that of the Fisher home. In the world of Westworld, the high-tech behind-the-scenes locations are meant to represent progress and civility, and the park represents savagery and the world left behind due to its simplicity. However, when watching the show, you realize that this is very much the inverse. The existence of the technology below the park is a deliberate choice to show that there's an existing moral hierarchy with the humans being literally and metaphorically below everything else. Furthermore, the people running the park are constantly being seen as viewing themselves above everything. They physically look down on the park when observing the overall map, as well as building part of the resort complex looking out over the park as well. The dynamic that the humans crafted for themselves, in and of itself, reflects the falseness of it all. The robotic and technological world is the one that seems emotionally archaic, and not the nature-centric West. The two different worlds reveal different associations with death, just as the Fisher House does in 6 Feet Under. The park has an aura of deathlessness to it, and immortality, with the ability to reset and revive hosts, and the hypothetical inability of guests to die. It is meant to circumvent the natural process of life, despite feeling far less natural than the actual world around it. The real world feels far more lifeless and hopeless. In the first season, we get no other glimpses into this world outside of the facilities that serve the park, which is what creates an interesting narrative. It is this mystery and sparseness of the sets that helps to add to the overall mystery of the show, while still conveying the idea that life outside has become dull. Not only this, but due to the narrative bits that inform viewers that the park is immensely expensive, we know that this form of escapism is only accessible to the massively wealthy and influential. The Good Place and the Rehearsal have a slightly different approach to the use of space, with theirs not being layered, but more separated into zones. The Rehearsal can be categorized as having the set worlds meant for the rehearsals, as well as the actual spaces that end up being used. The separation between what Fielder has control over is what differentiates these spaces from each other throughout the show. There is only so much that he has direct control over, which in a sense traps him within his own world, as he is often seen spending time and working within the confines of the sets that he himself has created. These zones are not always immediately clear when watching the show, but that is part of what creates complexity, since it can be difficult to tell what is real and what is not throughout. The Good Place, on the other hand, is very explicit with its zones after its reveal at the end of Season 1. The fake Good Place, the real Good Place, Middle Place, Bad Place, the World of the Living, and even Janet's Void all exist clearly as separate spaces that the characters traverse throughout the course of the show. Each of these places has a distinct flair, with the Bad Place and real Good Place having the heaviest contrasts, as expected. The dark colors and drab settings of the Bad Place contrast heavily with the modern, colorful world of the real Good Place. The transitions between these spaces often feels surreal, with sparse sets of endlessness to communicate the concept of being outside of time and space. It is clear from a narrative perspective that the characters have little power in most of these spaces, but the degree of control over them varies and decreases over the course of the show as they become more familiar with these different zones. These spaces seem to be situated in a more linear way than layered on top of each other the way that 6 Feet Under's and Westworld's are, but this doesn't take away from aspects of connectivity between them and how they come together to form the complete picture of the afterlife. These separation of spaces relate to some of the elements of escapism within these shows and how that further expands the influence of design within the worlds. Nature's role. While creating a centralized space can capture the central themes of a show with intricate set design, sometimes it is the set design that is the most reserved that can have the biggest impact, as previously stated. All elements of the production process can take a reserved approach, whether it's a lack of camera movement, long takes untouched by edits, or silence induced by a lack of score, and reserved or minimal sets are no different. Some of the most clear examples of reserved set design come from scenes that take place in nature, and these spaces also represent an interesting inverse to the concept of the central hub idea and less structured from the idea of the layers and zones. These spaces are often ignored when considering the importance of set design, but it is the subtleties in these sequences that give them impact. The fact that these spaces seem uncontrolled is part of what allows them to have this quality, but through the design implemented they can be influenced and just as controlled as built sets. Westworld might be the most clear and present example of the impact that nature's presence has on a show. Nature is a fundamental part of the show, as it often represents an escape from the real world. It is the furthest from the apparent technological elements, despite still being a manufactured location. Nature in many shows or movies represents the untamed, or other elements outside of the control of humanity. In Westworld, it is a place that is controlled, yet as a result, is the place that feels most tame and serene. The actual park is meant to serve as an escape from the real world, which is ironic because the nature in the show is what feels most alive and real, despite the manufactured element to the park. The Good Place is very different in terms of the scope of its nature, as it is not often depicted over the course of the show, but when it is, it often represents a level of tranquility, just as Westworld does. Since so much of the world of the afterlife is a constructed space, the presence of nature in it is sparing. The most striking use of nature in the show is in its final moments, where each character chooses when to move on from the afterlife in a wooded and calm place. The title of the episode, Whenever You're Ready, is very telling in the grand scheme of a show about eternal places, that everything comes to an end. Instead of having the location of this ending be in some grand place with bright colors and ceremony, like so much of the show, it is one of, if not the most reserved of the whole show. It speaks volumes about the ending, and instead of having sets that become the flashy focus, the set design choice here allows every character to be the focus of their own endings. A show so centered around locations allows the ending to be all about the characters and their acceptance with their own end. Those who have been controlled throughout the entire course of the story are finally able to make their own choices in the presence of this natural place. Rehearsal is also limited with its use of nature since it is so centered on controlling that which cannot be controlled, but the instances where present are central to the elements of control over life. The manipulation of life is seen throughout the show, but the attempt to manipulate nature is perhaps one of the most striking things. Weather and time are aspects of the world that are often said to be uncontrollable, yet feel their attempts to influence these things nonetheless. In instances like manufactured aging, creating artificial seasons, and accelerating garden growth, we can see this manipulation as well. This is an example where the elements of nature are more closely aligned with the set design of the physical structures, as all elements are working towards the same goal. It is done in such a way that only works within the context of a show like this, but it is necessary to fulfill the goals of creating realistic rehearsals. In 6 Feet Under, they use nature to represent a form of release from control. The lives of the Fishers often feel so structured, which is why when nature comes into play, it feels as though the characters are able to escape the drama and tragedy of their lives. Characters often go on hikes or on camping trips, and these are the only times it feels the characters are truly free of the death that surrounds them constantly. The house is the epicenter of death, and nature provides the furthest thing from this, spatially and thematically. The least structured places from a set point of view are also the least restrictive for the characters in the story. These moments are often very revealing for how the characters truly feel, and it allows us a glimpse into their lives without the filter of work or school to hide these emotions. Nature is so representative of life that it is no coincidence that these moments are normally when the characters are the most alive and free. However, perhaps the most striking uses of nature in the show are with the burials of Lisa and Nate that are meant to be a return to nature for their bodies, in which a strong connection between nature and death is evident. However, while these moments are heart-wrenching, they represent the circle of life and ultimately is part of what helps the other characters to let go and move forward with the next stages of their own lives. Nature provides an escape in a sense, in these situations, by taking the form of an aid to grief rather than a place of solace. The use of nature in sets has an immense thematic significance in media, and when used properly can represent just as much as elaborate constructed sets of buildings or other places. The world as a whole. The importance of each of the pieces discussed is vital to how these shows function and convey central themes, but these are only parts of the shows that cover a much greater scope than just a few select places. Set design is what helps to unite the different places within a show and make them all feel believably interconnected. Westworld is a massive epic that is full of shifting storylines and moving parts in a thematic and world-building sense. The two aspects we see represent the world of the humans and the world of the androids. Within the story, we see the humans are able to occupy both worlds via control over this artificial landscape and the artificial beings within. However, at the end of the first season, we see that the androids are moving towards inhabiting the human world as well as they begin to rebel. The idea of human versus machine becomes flipped on its head throughout as these lines become blurrier. The allegedly savage park becomes the far more tame and humane of the two. The place that is shaped for adventure becomes a cesspool for depravity that corrupts the humans that encounter it. Characters like William become entrenched in the mysteries and violence of the park, leading to the twist that he is the depraved man in black towards the end of the season. The story also constantly references the concept of a maze, with it representing the complexities of consciousness. Each of the different facets of the park reflects the themes of the show, and the set design reflects each of them in turn. In The Good Place, it is the deception of the world as a whole that drives the story. Once it is revealed that the true setting is part of the bad place, the elements that seem like inconsistencies in the design of the world and the storytelling become clear. It is a twist that gives the world such a dynamic nature. The world, and by extension the sets, adapt to the characters as they adapt in order to find the best way to torment them. The world is reshaped over and over again, while the characters are forced to adapt to the changes. It is a world that goes through more variations than the characters themselves. As the show goes on, we also get to see and experience more and more of what the afterlife of this world has to offer. The show is never complacent with its world building and continues to grow and show a diversity of spaces throughout. The Rehearsal is another example of a world that adapts to the characters as the story progresses. Each of the different locations throughout are shaped in order to fit the people and the scenario. The places also often take on a secondary purpose even after the sets are used. The bar, as mentioned earlier, serves as an especially weird space and a point of escapism for Fielder, who is seen multiple times spending time in the fake bar. The Raising Cane's restaurant is also a weird place, especially with how far that storyline goes in terms of breaking from the original plan. It still comes almost full circle, but is utilized more as a space for manipulation than pure rehearsal space like the bar. The acting class location isn't a built set like the other two, or as unique as the house, but it has a more blank slate quality and serves as a place to create and adapt the personalities that Fielder has the actors take on. He truly shapes the world with the help of sets in order to try to completely control the world around him. 6 Feet Under has a similarly complex world in an entirely different way. Instead of molding the real world to an essentially fictional one, like The Rehearsal does, 6 Feet Under crafts an incredibly realistic LA using a fictional story. The work of the production designer and the art department as a whole work to make the LA within the show as realistic as possible in order to give the show the impact it has. Although there are moments where characters go through dream sequences, the show as a whole is incredibly honest. It wants to be relatable to people, so that its themes hit hard. The setting is also such an integral part of the tone of the show. Choosing to have it take place in a city nicknamed the City of Angels completely matches the themes of death that the show covers. The constant sunshine is also a major factor in what helps to give the show a lighter tone despite some of its darker themes. LA is such a fast-moving city that the stopping power of death creates interesting situations throughout the show. It shows that anything can happen at any time and uses this to create these odd situations that range from emotionally devastating to darkly comic. The scope of LA can often be massive in different media works, but in 6 Feet Under the stories are mostly contained in small scale. The show is crafted in such a way that the characters still often feel confined despite being in such a dynamic city. It is a show that could seemingly take place anywhere, but nowhere fits the story quite like Los Angeles. Each of these places form the stories and vice versa. The composition of the worlds is what helps all of these ideas to be fluid and work with aiding the story. Conclusion. The set design used for television is designed to work in a long-form context, which is part of what makes it so difficult to perfect. It is different from film in that these sets are modified over much longer periods of time, but must maintain the intricacy of those film sets. A production designer may work on a series for multiple years, creating a constant presence throughout the creative process. The production designer can often be one of the most present people that work on a show given their involvement in every episode in the seasons that they work on. Another major difference between television and film is the budget with which they have to work. With many shows, there is a massive upfront cost, with the initial design of the sets, and then subsequent costs associated with bringing new sets into later episodes or seasons. Even within the selected shows, there is a clear difference in funding between the 3 HBO shows and The Good Place, which is a network show. Each of these come with different challenges, as the art department is often the one that has to get creative with budgeting. With the larger budgets on shows like Westworld come bigger expectations with what is required of the art department. The creative process when developing sets is more than just being creative with design, but also being creative with what is provided. The teams on these shows had to be masterful with how they crafted their sets in order for the shows to complement the themes. Budget becomes a real-world element that doesn't control the sets of a show, but can force it to take creative directions in order to be successful. Set design is so often overlooked, but none of these shows are what they are without the intricate detailing and thought that went into the creation of the world. Westworld could have been disconnected and scattered. The Good Place could have been cheesy and cartoonish. The Rehearsal could have been a complete disaster that lacked any true outcome from its rehearsals, and 6 Feet Under could have felt sloppy and unrealistic. However, none of these are the case, as the set design is crafted so that none of these issues are ever present. These shows deal with control constantly, and use set design to influence the way the show represents the themes of life and death. These are not simple thematic concepts. They are complex. They are at the center of these shows, which is what makes them so impactful when it comes to showing off their set design. They illustrate the importance of the multifaceted nature of set design in a variety of genres and formats, and are examples of why everyone should pay more attention to the value of this piece of filmmaking. It is an art form, and it is present in all forms of media that we consume, from the shortest commercial to television shows spanning over a dozen seasons. It deserves a far greater degree of respect from the filmmaking world and society as a whole, as it is literally what creates the worlds we see when we go to the movie theater or turn on a TV. A special thanks to Professor Christine Becker, my academic advisor for this video essay, as well as Zach Grobler, one of the production designers for Westworld, and Suzuki Ingerslev, one of the production designers for 6 Feet Under, in being willing to meet with me about their work. Thank you.